I'm Dean Walker, and welcome to the Poetry of Predicament podcast, a podcast for people brave enough to face humanity's challenges and problems, and most importantly, our numerous predicaments. The Poetry of Predicament is a podcast meant to inspire us to bring forth grace, beauty, and connection with the web of life in the face of a predicament-laden world. I recently was struck by an article I read in HuffPost called Staring Down the Apocalypse. And what really struck me even more than the remarkable content of that article was that the author, Derek Penwell, turns out to be a senior minister of Douglass Boulevard Christian Church in Louisville, Kentucky, joined me for a remarkable conversation about a faith community becoming activists and being engaged in the world like very few other communities of which I'm aware. Derek Penwell. I was getting ready for you and me talking by reading one more time your article, Staring Down the Apocalypse. And if I could, I'd just like to give you a little backstory about what really grabbed my attention about
Absolutely.
your reading. So I have never been much of a religious person at all, but I've gone into some pretty extensive spiritual disciplines in my life and have some experience there, just not with much of the environment, the atmosphere of a religious context for it.
Right.
And for a lot of years, it was actually I was aggressively anti-religious for a number of reasons, which really aren't important
Sure.
for the conversation. But I had myself kind of a large-scale woke moment about 5 years ago, after being a environmentalist for my whole life. I was exposed to some information that could be called abrupt climate change, and it also could be, in a larger scale, called collapse of Earth and human systems, and elements of it threatening to occur within my old guy lifetime.
Sure.
And that was the big woke moment. One of the pieces that came to me, I immediately went into writing a book about how I had to vet the material and make sure this wasn't just, crazy stuff.
Sure.
What I discovered was that a number of these spiritual disciplines and so on that I'd been involved with had given me some kind of inner capacity, inner skill set that I could call on really unexpectedly with this scale of what I was now seeing on the horizon, or to some degree that we're in right now. And one of the words that is used an awful lot around that is apocalypse. So that's, the first reason I was drawn to your article.
Right.
Then I looked back in my experience, and my book is called The Impossible Conversation for a number of reasons, most of which is our culture, the global business as usual culture, just does not want to hear that we will no longer have growth, which means no longer the kind of economy that we're used to, which means that our lovely, luxurious, addictive lifestyles will need to change in a way that most of us won't be too happy about.
Right.
And you point toward that in your article. So another reason why I'm wanting to talk with you. So I'm finally getting to the point, and thank you for listening to all this.
Yeah, no, this is fine.
What I found in these, I had a lot of impossible conversations. I made a point of reaching out to people who did not process like I did not see the world like I did, and ask them, what's important to you? And would you take a moment and listen to what's important to me and give me your feedback? That kind of a thing.
Yes.
And what I discovered was the only people that had any kind of resonance with those kind of inner skills that I was talking about, those kind of spiritual tools and practices that I had integrated. One of them turned out that there's a word that's more often than not used for the experience of the upwelling of this immense amount of power that's available to people.
Mm-hmm.
More often than not, we would end up calling it grace together, grace. And that was only available in conversations with people who had a substantial religious version of that kind of woke moment, that kind of cracking open. Some people might call it being reborn and so on. And I'm sorry if I'm sounding pedantic, because I know you're
No.
far more knowledgeable about that side of the conversation than I am. I'm just trying to share there was this resonance and this way of, like, we found common ground, and it was wonderful.
Yes.
The last piece I'd like to give you is kind of the lead up of this is I find myself confused more often than not, and worse inside of my own reactions, about what is the religious community doing in terms of stewardship on this planet. It doesn't matter, Christians or Muslims or Jews, or I don't care. Anybody who has this sense of we're in God's community, which I have my different words for, but I consider myself now very much in that same boat.
Mm-hmm.
It calls me forward. And I hear, again, you had some calling that you were implying in that article. And so I'm wondering, I'm not expecting you to answer for all Christians by any stretch, so no pressure there.
No.
But I so appreciated the elements that you included in your writing. And so obviously that you are a person of your faith and a community that you're very active in. And so I'm wondering, really the nature of my wanting to talk with you was to see if you could help me, people like myself who don't have that community, don't have access. And then, just for a little bit of an example of what drives me crazy, like I can't figure it out, is how we could have the person who is now the president of the United States backed by some large amount of the evangelical community. And I don't understand, because he looks like he's taking us down, taking life down, taking the social contract that you mentioned in your article down. So thank you so much for listening to that long kind of backstory and preparation. And I would invite you, if anything I've said sparks you in a particular direction, once again, I'll just say, welcome, Derek Penwell. And if you wouldn't mind just starting with a little bit of introduction of yourself, I'd sure appreciate it.
Absolutely. So I'm the senior pastor at Douglass Boulevard Christian Church here in Louisville, Kentucky. I have been here for almost 11 years now. And I also teach at the University of Louisville in the Comparative Humanities department. And I've got a new book coming out in February called Outlandish, An Unlikely Messiah, a Messy Ministry, and the Call to Mobilize. And part of that comes from precisely this kind of sense that we're in a situation where people feel unequipped to be able to deal with the challenges of a world that is sort of throwing things at them that they never anticipated before. And it feels fairly chaotic and overwhelming. And this is an attempt to try to look to Jesus as a way of being active in the pursuit of justice and equity and peace for people who are often the most vulnerable. And then how is it that we form communities of resistance that are capable of acting in sort of religious terms, you'd say faithfully, but I would also feel comfortable just talking about it with integrity, to support one another and the planet that we live on. And the thing that I thought about when you were talking about your experience of finding words for your sort of epiphany, and that some of those words resonated with a kind of religious context. And it made me think about the fact that when I teach introduction to the study of religion in the university, or I teach world religions, the way I start is by talking about languages. And I ask people, students, can you speak a different language? And they will, some of them will, and I get some interesting things. This last semester I had Arabic, I had Spanish, I had Turkish. I mean, it was just fascinating, but I had them all write a phrase on the board, a simple phrase, I can read a book. And then I would have them say it to the class, and then I would say, which of these languages do you think is most beautiful? Or I'd say, which is best? And they get a really puzzled look on their face, and they say, well, I don't know what that means exactly in relationship to languages. And I say, well, which one do you think is most beautiful? And they say, well, again, with the possible exception that perhaps French is better for pillow talk than German. It's not immediately apparent which one is more aesthetically pleasing. And I said, and religions are like language systems that try to find ways of expressing experience. And we each have our own grammars and our own syntax, the kind of rules that we use. But what we're trying to say often points back to the same experience that people feel, regardless of whether or not they have any religious commitments. And we're just trying to find words for that and our connection to the divine, to the world we live in, to each other. That's an important, I think, in an attempt to find commonality, to find ways in which we're naming the same experience, but we're often using words that aren't necessarily clear to one another. And the kind of conversations that you have, I really admire, because that takes a great deal of work and intentionality that most people just aren't willing to invest, because it is work, trying to empathize, to come to some sense of how other people experience the world.
Yeah. Well, I'm following you, and I appreciate it. And gosh, I wish I could clone you, because you've just mentioned a number of different things that seem to me, I'm the kind of guy that read the Bible in my late teens because I would bump into people who had the religion that they would be, in this case, in my neighborhood and so on. They'd be pretty vocal about it and kind of pushy about wanting me to believe like they do and so on. And so I just had to do my research, kind of like I just did for my book about the collapse of systems. I had to do some vetting because, what is this stuff? And so I read the Bible, and it turns out most of them had not. And there's this, again, I guess I'm just going back indirectly to that last frustration point that I was sharing, that there are a number of different sects of the Christian religion and a number of different stances with regard to what's important and how they express what's important to that sect in terms of politics, in terms of presence in the community, and present in terms of how they interact with other populations in the culture and so on. I'm curious if you have much interaction with other branches of Christianity, and how do the conversations go? Because I know I'm different enough that it's often me doing all the stretching and all the reaching out and all the let's have this interesting conversation kind of stuff. I'm wondering, are there big rifts? Are there big differences in your experience between different branches of Christianity? Or is it not quite, are the rifts not quite so big from your perspective?
That's a great question. No, I think that they are as big as you imagine.
Hmm.
Not unlike, I think, probably our politics at the moment. There's a great deal of division, and I'll sort of lay my cards on the table. I grew up in an evangelical environment. I grew up in Grand Rapids, Michigan, which is really sort of the heart of evangelical publishing. My dad worked for evangelical publishers. And my family is still, who lives up there, are still evangelicals. My sort of evolution away from evangelicalism has a great deal to do with the fact that I've spent so much time studying the Bible. And that's not to say that evangelicals don't study the Bible. It's simply to say that I think they do it. I have to be careful here, but I think they do it wrong. In some cases, for example, it seems to me impossible to read through the Gospels and come away thinking that Jesus would look at this presidency and say, yeah, that's exactly what I had in mind. Or to sort of read through Jesus' interaction with the peasant population of Galilee and Judea, and come away thinking that, yeah, taking food stamps away from people, that's a really good expression of my faith. I just don't understand the leap necessary to come up with the kinds of positions that ignore the obvious and cynical taking advantage that so many people on the right, both politically and religiously, seem so committed to. I'm befuddled by that. In my conversations, because of the way I am, and the way I write and so forth, just tends to be fairly provocative, sarcastic, and satirical, and the conversations that I used to have often center on the fact that many of my colleagues and my friends and family in the evangelical side of the religious world sort of saw me as a sellout, I stopped taking the Bible seriously. And my argument with them was, and continues to be, I'm a progressive, not in spite of the fact that I'm a follower of Jesus, but precisely because I am.
Yeah.
That I think that is the most faithful expression of what it is that gets laid out for us in the whole scope of Scripture. And so, we can keep talking about it. I have a great deal of disappointment with some of my co-religionists. And frankly, just to be honest with you, I have a number of friends in the interfaith community with whom I have more in common faith-wise than many of my co-religionists who are Christians on the other side of the spectrum.
Okay.
A lot.
Again, I'm reassured and appreciate so much your stance in how to be a human being in these times is really what I think we're talking about, whether it's, in a religious context or not. If I could just shift for a moment to something that again is filled with my ignorance. So I have just enough kind of knowledge or factoids to sort of formulate a question.
Mm-hmm.
And that is, I'm struck that there is some kind of there's some amount of people, there's some population, some subset, particularly of, again, particular sects within Christianity that have this, they have a different kind of a way of seeing the word apocalypse, and it's actually good news for them. And I think you imply their stance in your article, which, by the way, I'm going to be linking in the show notes for this podcast, and I'll actually post it in the website as well, so people can find both very easily. It's disconcerting to me, to whatever degree there are people, no matter their religious beliefs, that can jump right to end times,
Mm-hmm.
to that this is what's prophesized, so let's just go pedal to the metal and make it happen because it's all good right after that. Now, I'm being a little snarky, so I apologize, but do you get the sense of my question, and can you address it at all?
Yeah, no, that has long been a problem for I think, a view of Scripture that takes books like the Book of Revelation or the Book of Daniel or the prophecies of Jesus and sees them as some kind of roadmap for bored middle-class white people to make it through, the coming of Armageddon, so that with their 401k still intact. And that is snarky also. But my point is, those books were written in a particular context. So the author of the Book of Revelation, for example, wasn't thinking at the time, I'll bet there are going to be people a couple thousand years from now who are going to need this in order to determine how it is they support the state of Israel. In fact, he was writing to people who were under great pressure and were dealing with persecution and the uncertainty of being a minority population in a hostile environment. And in order to do that, he had to write in such a way that was not immediately intelligible to the powers that be, right? So the folks he's writing to, they understand the references that he's making about who's who and the current world they live in. But the people who might stumble across it, they don't understand all of the references and so forth. And so it's not quite so volatile for the community for it to fall into the wrong hands. So a great deal of what Apocalypse accomplishes is trying to give people the strength to endure a world that feels like it is caving in on them. One of the great examples of this, of course, are the spirituals in the middle of the 19th century, which are about crossing over in campground or swing low, sweet chariot, coming for to carry me home. These sorts of songs, they communicate both a hope, not just in some eschatological future, not just at some point beyond this life or this time, but operate as a way of offering hope and strength that there is a time coming even now that we can be a part of if we're faithful that reverses these issues. And so one of the points I make in the article, and one of the things that I talk about quite a bit, it's Advent, for example, season in many Christian denominations, and that is a time of looking toward the inbreaking of God into the world, not just in Bethlehem, but at some point in the future. And the point I try to make is apocalyptic literature is not something that people who have a lot to lose care much for, because it always threatens to upend the world as it is currently situated. And that is a really dangerous sort of word to hear if you have a vested interest in things remaining the way they are.
So the more privileged I am, the more disruption that is promised with any kind of apocalyptic Armageddon-like occurrence.
Yes, well, think about the sensitivity of even something like Wall Street. I mean, a stray comment here or there can send things, as we've seen lately, completely sort of spiraling, and that's because there's so much investment in things staying stable and predictable the way they are, because if they start shifting around, I might be the one that gets left behind. But the flip side of that is, for people who don't take for granted that the world has been constructed with them in mind, that they're always sort of on the outside with their nose pressed against the glass looking in, that for those people, a word that says this world is going to be shaken to its foundations is good news. There's a story about a woman who wrote in her journal just after Sherman left Columbia, South Carolina. Left it in flames and so forth. And she writes, it was just chaos and awfulness, and essentially a kind of realization that the end of the Old South had come about. And it sounded very dark and dire. But what she failed, of course, to say is that there were people who had been other folks' property who were dancing in the streets, right? It depends on where you are when you hear the news and where you're standing as to whether or not apocalypse is a good thing. And we who have been largely privileged, it's hard for us to hear. But one of the things that I think faith communicates to me is that I have a larger stake in trying to pave the way for a world that where everybody's able to flourish, than I have a stake in trying to keep things safe for me and mine.
Got it. So again, thank you for that. That was just a really clean and clear and really beautiful layout of your thinking and your orientation. And so thank you. And I'm curious how much alignment do you have with what the mapping that you've just done of your orientation? How much is that shared by others in your community, your parish, the people that are important to you in the circles that you truck in? And actually, if you wouldn't mind saying that kind of thing about the community at large, not just about the faith community, but, can you give us kind of a weather report about your area, the various circles that you are interacting with? Is yours a fairly common stance?
That's an excellent question. There are a handful of churches who are committed to the same kinds of things that we are in the community here at Douglass Boulevard Christian Church. People come to us because we are extremely vocal and present in the community. I do work with the Fairness Campaign, which is a local LGBTQ rights. It's actually statewide now. I've done work with Black Lives Matter and Surge. I do work for Planned Parenthood and the ACLU, La Casita, and a variety of things across the board, refugee ministries, that kind of thing. We believe, as a congregation, that those are ways of living out our faith. That's who Jesus asks us to be, and that there's no way to separate religion and politics, because politics is always about how it is the community decides together how to organize its common life, and it can be done equitably, or it can be done in ways that take advantage of the most vulnerable. And we have a responsibility to sort of put our thumb on the scale on the side of those folks who don't have the capability to do it themselves. Mm-hmm. So that's our sort of religious community. There are other congregations in our area who are there shoulder to shoulder with us on this, but it is not, I would not say common. I think that many churches, both sort of evangelical and mainline Protestant churches, not to mention our Catholic siblings, have some idea of church as a place to go to do what? Get right with God, to become a better person, and so and that's sort of the dominant paradigm, that you come to us and we will help fix what is wrong with you and make you able to be better in whatever ways you're searching for. But our understanding of church is that church is the place that you come to be sent back out, right? That we come in order to find the strength and the wisdom to be able to go back out and do the work where Jesus would have been. It just seems beyond belief to me to think that Jesus would have spent most of his time in sort of committee meetings in church. That, you know, I mean, that just beggars the imagination to me, that the real work is not what we do in these walls, but how what we do in these walls prepares us to go outside these walls and be a representative of the kind of peace and justice we think that God is calling down.
Yeah. Well said. I'm wondering when you're gonna really just crack it wide open and do some stand-up, man. I think you're good. I think you're really good. You know, I unless you have another direction that you'd like to go in for a little while, I'd like to ask you about kind of a more pragmatic level, if I may. Mm-hmm. So let me just check in. Is there something else that in the direction where you've been headed that you'd like to say more about?
So this summer, I don't know if you've heard of the Poor People's Campaign.
Yes.
With Dr. William Barber and a number of sort of national figures. They rolled out a time this summer of intentional sort of moral revival, 6 weeks, in 39 states where groups of people of faith and those people who support this kind of thing would come to the capitals of the states and raise issues about the environment. In Kentucky, for example, we have coal mining and the problems with the coal mining industry, but also about gun violence, about health care, about criminal justice reform, all of these things. We would go and we would try to raise the awareness of both the population at large, but the legislators and so forth. Well, that kind of direct action, as just recently happened a day or two ago in San Diego with a number of clergy being arrested at the border, is about, we often call it protest, but it's direct action to be able to try to put our bodies in between the people in power and those who don't have all the resources they need to protect themselves. And that sometimes means you do things like Martin Luther King, from whom this whole Poor People's Campaign is a sort of reprisal of the 1960s. And so one of the things that we're doing, that's a long way to get to what I'm going to say. One of the things that we're talking about right now, I and some other religious leaders in the community is forming a sort of quick response ministerial direct action team, so that if somebody is being carted away, illegally for deportation or whatever, that we can get on the phone and we can turn out a number of clergy to go down there in collars and stoles and stuff and stand between that and try to disrupt it, because sometimes that's the only way that power hears criticism, is if people sort of put their bodies out there. And so that's one of the practical ways that we're trying to think about how we can best use our resources as well as our sort of reputations in the community and that kind of thing for good.
Yeah. Would you say again what that organization is? And was that at the state level?
Well, it's a national organization. It's called the Poor People's Campaign.
But and a portion of the Poor People's Campaign is the collection of clergy that you were talking about.
Well, the idea for direct action among our local clergy, in large part, is inspired for me by my participation at the state level with the Poor People's Campaign. There is something powerful to clergy people going up to the governor's mansion with a Bible and saying, we'd like to give this gift to the governor in hopes that he will read it, and perhaps be convicted to act like it makes a difference in how he governs. I mean, that kind of stuff. Mm-hmm. In many ways, it's a visible sort of thing, but that's the way you have to raise awareness in a culture where it's so easy to shout down opposition.
A big part of the work that I do is assisting people with, first a multi-step process. The first one oftentimes is the most uncomfortable, and that is to just become more fully present to what's actually going on the planet. Mm-hmm. Like the indicators are not looking good from my point of view, and hundreds and hundreds of articles and so on. Another step in the average person's process, kind of walking this path, is to struggle with how ill prepared most of us are to to face the scale of what's actually happening, of what's so. And I'm wondering if that's similar in your experience, because you actually have a structure in place. That's really what churches are about. You invite somebody new in, and they have that kind of step-by-step eyes opening and experience opening, and being included in what you do. I'm wondering if you could say anything about what you're seeing about how prepared or not people are, no matter how long they've been in a faith community. And do you have any suggestions, any things that you're actually putting into use that expands people's capacity, that has your particular faith community be stronger, and in how they interact with one another, how it expands their capacity to then turn around and participate more fully in the community? Is that making sense how I'm asking it?
Yeah. And I think the way I would sort of talk about that is, it is very much the case in our situation, and I can't speak for everyone else, but that the folks who come here are drawn to us because we're doing this stuff. And so they already have a kind of sense and impulse toward that kind of participation in the community at the start. That's why they come. So I don't have to do a whole lot of sort of convincing people who come here. Part of my job is to find ways to help give them the resources they need to do some of the work that they feel called to do. And that's a pretty exciting position to be in. And so how we continue to work is to try to drive that emphasis home, that we are about living and acting in this world as agents of a God who wants the best for all God's children, not just for the people who can afford it. And so, sort of underlining that message over and over and over again. And at some point, our participation in a community winds up shaping us, even in ways that we don't necessarily see, that in ways that operate under the horizon of our awareness, until one day we wake up and we say, oh my gosh, I actually really care about this stuff. I can't imagine not caring about it. And that and you can fill this stuff in with all kinds of things. We have people here who are really committed to food justice. We have people here who care very much about eco-justice. I mean, it just, not to mention, equitable treatment of LGBTQ people, of people who have in the disability community. It's here is, we hope, a hub that provides people both the resources and the kind of motivation to do what we think they, in many cases, feel like they want to do, but just don't know quite how to plug in.
Yeah. Yeah. This might seem like an odd question, but I don't know. But again, with the folks that I work with primarily are people who are self-selecting at a pretty extreme end of the conversation, meaning
Yes.
on a scale of apocalypse and collapse of systems and things are serious. No, they're really even more serious kind of thing. These are on the really even more serious end of the conversation, folks. Yeah. And something I've noticed is that actually, truthfully, I've noticed this for quite some time. I've been in the training business for a long time, and that has oftentimes been training adults to work with very challenging young people in intensive situations and workshops. And a part of that, and a part of my own community involvement has shown me for a long time that we collectively don't seem to have much skill at self-regulation, at self-soothing, at self-awareness in the first place. And so my judgment about that is that the vast majority of us are running pretty close to maximum ambient anxiety without even knowing it, because we've normalized it.
Yes.
And I'm curious first if that's your experience as well, and how y'all might, if you address it at all, or perhaps you do and you have a whole body of work around it. I'm actually doing my best to cobble together a body of work about it, which is certainly not unique to me by any stretch, but I find that the stakes are higher because people have positioned themselves in an orientation of seeing the world that we've got some really serious stuff going on. Like the possibility that virtually all the larger fauna of the world, wild animals of the world, will be gone by 2026.
Mm-hmm.
That's just mind-blowing. And to actually slow down and stop and feel that, and to really let that into our hearts, can be devastating. So I guess what I'm asking is, again, do you get a sense of what I was saying, that yes, people are, we could call it full, kind of up to here with an ambient normalized anxiety or depression for that matter?
Mm-hmm.
And if so, do you have a language for that in your world, and methodology to address that and so on?
Yeah. Interestingly enough, in both sort of seminary communities where ministers and priests are trained, rabbis, as well as in the social justice community, they talk a lot about self-care. Mm-hmm. Because as you, I think, brilliantly stated, in this sort of ambient level of anxiety that's been raised, sort of unbeknownst to us at times, it's just there. We've just gotten used to how awful things are, that you can get overwhelmed. You can get exhausted really easily. I find the same kind of things about myself after doing this work for as long as I've been doing it. And part of the motivation for me is sort of anger and righteous indignation.
Yeah.
That prompts me to do and say things that might otherwise be easy for me to avoid doing or saying. But the reality of it,
I'm raising my hand over here, saying, yeah, I know that one very well. So keep going.
Yes, no, exactly. But it's at some point it begins to dawn on you that you can't be angry all the time. Mm-hmm. Because A, that's not what life is supposed to be about anyway, but B, it's just not sustainable as a strength. And as a consequence, what you have to learn to do is to set some boundaries between yourself and the work. and know that while you may have a heavy investment in the work, you are not the work, you are you. And part of the prerequisites for continuing this work for any length of time is that you take care of you by understanding that you're a whole human being, and not just a kind of sharpened edge for the resistance. Um, because it's just, you just can't do it. And people who are really heavily involved in the kind of day-to-day gritty stuff that comes with protest and advocacy, they have a real awareness. If they don't, they burn out and just leave. But those who stick around, they have a real awareness that they have to be a part of a larger community that's doing this work, that allows them to pull back from time to time and watch a movie or do something with your family, or just think. Um, and in thinking about the world we live in, not just get mad about the fact that we've squandered this wonderful gift we've been given in so many ways, we've despoiled it, but to think about the wonderful gift, right? To think about how amazing this world is, our ability to participate in trying to spare it from us.
It leads me to a cornerstone in this body of work, again, that I don't take any credit whatsoever for including it. It's a long standing cornerstone of just being a human being in a good way, and that is to find gratitude.
Yes.
And to keep looking for gratitude and keep generating gratitude. So that's really what I heard you saying. And I would also say that another one of those cornerstones is the the notion of being fully present. When I was talking about that grace, when a conversation's going really well between myself and this other person who has more religious context for grace, and we're kind of comparing notes, like what gets you there, and how often do you get to feel that, and that kind of stuff.
Right.
It's almost like a little fan club of like, oh really, you've experienced it too, wow. And one thing that I've noticed, I've been blessed with the most interesting up and down experience of being immersed in grace, punctuated throughout my life. And at one point I had about 6 months of being fully immersed in grace the vast majority of every single day, out of having a very serious physical injury. And the state that I went into for the recovery was an extended experience of grace. And what I've noticed is that if I now have access, I can literally, while you and I are talking, I can touch into that grace. It's not something I have to do hours of prayer to return to, or some sort of ritualistic practice, although those are still good and I do those. But what I've seen consistent, no matter who I'm talking to, no matter which tradition or path they might have been using to get to that state of grace, what we all share is that whatever the path is, it brings us to full presence and to being fully present.
Yes.
And so it really tells me a lot about how everything else that I do in my life, that I fill up my day with, all the distractions and all the things that take me away from being more fully present, are actually, I don't want to say adversarial, but they certainly are clutter.
Yes.
They're mischievous clutter And when I compare it to my experience of grace, why on earth would I let that clutter build up? Is that making sense?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I don't know if that sparks you to say anything, but for some reason I was inspired to share that out of what you were saying. So,
Well, no, I appreciate that. No, I do think that one of the traditions that seems to span uh, religious practice and spirituality for throughout history is this sort of dawning awareness that presence, holy presence, um, is is actually the way to connect with the divine, if that's happens to be what you're looking for, or with the world we live in, or with ourselves, or with one another. But the truth that it uncovers is that we don't have any other place to be, right? I mean, we can only be here now.
mm-hmm.
And to the extent that we're somewhere else in our mind or in our heart, in our memory, in our anxiety, we are not living. We are sort of biding time.
Mm-hmm.
And the more we can be present, which is the meditation practices and so forth, about breathing and so forth. It's about being here now and learning to be where you are when you're there, as opposed to being someplace else. I think that's extraordinarily not only important but nourishing.
Yeah.
It gives us the strength to live in troubled times.
Yeah, I agree. It's a little bit difficult for me to find the right words to thank you for your time today. And, as grumpy as I've been about my relationship with religions for most of my my younger years, especially, I've really been hungry to find a sense of camaraderie. I don't need or want to join something. I don't have a hunger to take on a religion at this point. Who knows? Maybe I will. What I do have a hunger for is this kind of resonance, this kind of where we can reach out through what's really a remarkably small distance. Given this technology that we've got, I feel so connected with you.
Mm-hmm.
And I've been able to appreciate not just what I obviously resonated with in your article, but now to hear your words and to feel your presence. It's a gift. And in a remarkable way, we get to just be in each other's space and invite in some of that sacred you were just mentioning. And
Yes.
I'm not sure if there's anything more important for either of us or any of us to be doing than that kind of invitation and that kind of reaching out to connect. And of course, it will look different for every couple of people that decide to reach out.
I very much agree.
Yeah. Derek, I'm wondering if you would like to share with people how, if they'd like to know more about you, look for your writings, or do you have a website or a blog or other points of contact? And especially if you have any other programs that you feel good about that you'd like to suggest that people might look up. This would be a great opportunity, and of course I'll put those links underneath in the show notes. But how do we get a hold of you?
Well, you can find me on Facebook, obviously, and on Twitter. I'll send you a sort of short bio with some of these things. My site is derekpenwell.net, and I blog there, and I also am a weekly columnist for the Good Men Project. As I say, I have a book coming out in February that I'll provide you a link to, and that kind of stuff. But I'm happy to continue to have conversations with people who really care about this stuff, because I don't know that there's anything more important we should be doing right now than trying to figure out how we can live together in community in a world that is increasingly divided, because we'll kill each other.
Yeah. Well, and I would offer a similar bit of information about myself and the work that we're doing here in livingresilience.net. If you stumble across folks who don't have a religious orientation and are some way, it's just not quite a fit.
Yes.
But they're looking for, where can I find support? Where can I, have a free online support meeting, every couple of weeks, which we do. We do safe circle calls every other evening. That I think these are really important times where, one way or another, we need to find our people and also find the kind of safe containers where we can expand our capacities to be present, like we were just talking about. So I'm very, very happy to get your contact information out there. Very happy we've had this conversation, and I hope you don't mind if I reach out sometime relatively early in 2019 and just check in with you and see if you'd like to do another one of these.
Love to. I love to. This was really fun.
All right. Derek Penwell, thank you so much for being on Poetry of Predicament podcast, and have yourself a wonderful, wonderful holiday and New Year.
And thank you for having me, and you as well.
See you later.
Bye-bye.
Thanks for watching another episode of the Poetry of Predicament podcast, produced by Dean Walker and the Living Resilience Alliance, www.livingresilience.net. Music today from Michael Hedges, as always, and also Port Blue Into the Sea. You may want to check out our sister podcasts, the New Lifeboat Hour with Carolyn Baker on Podbean and at carolynbaker.net. Also, the Impossible Conversation podcast, another channel on YouTube. Thanks so much for joining us. Join us again later for another episode of the Poetry of Predicament.